Now let's see how some philosophers and critics of the late 20th century were interpreting postmodernism. We will begin with now half-forgotten figure, the American critic Leslie Fiddler. His dates are 1917-2003. In the year 1969, he published the article "Cross the Borders, Close the Gap." And everyone who handles these topics usually points out that the article was published not anywhere but in the magazine Playboy. That is, in the magazine addressed to an extremely wide audience, not anyway oriented towards intellectual heights. This was a conscious gesture, because Leslie Fiddler, main thesis of Leslie Fiddler was that contemporary art must overcome the boundaries of elitism. For modernism, that is the art of the first half of the 20th century, it was highly characteristic to draw a clear line between what was intended for everyone, what high-level art should not be interested, and an experimental, innovative, complex, elusive literature for the few. For Leslie Fiddler, exemplary postmodernists were such authors as John Barth, Boris Vian, or Norman Mailer. Umberto Eco could be added to them later in the 80s. These writers wrote very complicated texts, but they could be read at different levels. This idea would be picked up by Umberto Eco in his notes on the margins of The Name of the Rose, where he would say that his novels could be read on several levels. Someone can read Eco's novel The Name of the Rose as just a simple detective mystery story, and even the names of the characters prompted: William of Baskerville and his assistant Edson. Should remind the reader of Holmes and Watson. But someone else can read the same novel as a very deep philosophical text in which actually the entire medieval picture of the world was presented. In any case, Fiddler called for the filling in modes and the overcoming of the boundaries between the mass and elite, as well as between different genres of literature, including those between fiction and realism. Fantasy is real, he said, and the real is fictional. And Fiddler called modern artists double agents, which in the mass represented the elitists and in the elitists the mass. Not all postmodernist writers, as we shall see later, including Russian writers, managed to embody this program. But some still managed to some extent, although it was not so at all easy. Another important figure, which is necessary to recall in connection with the postmodernism, is the French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard. His dates is 1927-1998. His most famous book is called The Postmodern Condition. If we simplify it extremely roughly, the following can be said about it. Starting from the Enlightenment, that is from the second half of the 18th century in Europe, so-called meta-narrations were dominating. That is, the philosophers and literary men were sure that the world can be described and that in the world there exists a certain truth. But postmodernism is precisely the era that begins with disbelief in this great narrative, as Lyotard said. Disbelief in global, total means of expression. Anyone who says, "I know," anyone who is sure he is telling the truth is mistaken. And this is not about his personal error, but the fact that language invariably leads him to it. The world is pluralistic. In the world there are many languages possessing equal rights, and none of them is better than another. The world can only be seen as the place of realization of certain language games. These games go on continuously, they cannot be stopped, and the real artist is someone who is able to grasp this situation, express it in his texts, No one is bigger than anyone. No one is better than anyone. And work of mass literature is equal to James Joyce's Ulysses. The one only has to be able to read this mass literature properly. One only has to understand these works of art. For the Soviet Union, this thesis, although of course nobody heard about it there, was the most relevant. The fact is that the late Soviet Union was already a place where no one believed in great ideology, a communist one, in our case. And as we shall see later, almost all our postmodernists began precisely with the game with the science of power and with the language of power. Another source of postmodernism, worth to be mentioned here, is the concept introduced by the French philosophers Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. Rhizome. Rhizome is an idea of decentralized horizontal connections. In the old forms of the state, in the old forms of philosophy, religion, and literature, there always existed a valued center, to which everyone was reduced and which guided the activity of the whole. And now imagine just a simple thing, a mushroom spawn. In mushroom spawn, there is no center. There are only connections between the separate elements. Mushroom spawn can come to the surface in the form of fungi, but most part of its body is somewhere under the earth. It cannot be said that there is some kind of all-organizing center in it. And now in our times, one can give another example, of course, the internet. There is no center in this system of connections. There is no superior, the manager who would manage it. This system cannot be destroyed. This system cannot be prohibited. It reproduces itself in any situation. This is the metaphor of the postmodern universe. The universe in which vertical connections are replaced by horizontal ones. A universe in which individual elements are dominant, disorganized, chaotic, by and large related to each other, but not bound by a certain law. Another source, now in the field of literary studies, which is also worth mentioning, is associated with the names of Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault, two great French philosophers and critics. Both these figures are extremely important in general for the humanitarian studies of the 20th century. They showed themselves not only in literary study, but we are interested in two works, just two works that received the great resonance. They are related to the notion of authorship. In any literary work, there is some figure of a storyteller. It is one who utters those words that we read. This figure is usually called the narrator. And so, Roland Barthes, in the article The Death of the Author, raises the question, who is speaking? Analyzing some of Andrei de Balzac's texts, he shows that in any, even the most classical work, there is a zone of vagueness. That is, a zone in relation to which we cannot answer the question, who is speaking. The biographical author, for example, Andrei de Balzac, or his character, or some kind of author's mask, a representative of the author, and so on. In fact, concludes Barthes, there is no author. There is a discourse behind the author's figure, and this discourse is based on the idea of how an text should be written. So, in fact, the authorial figure disappears in the text itself. The text writes itself. The author disappears. The author is not the creator, but one of the components of the text itself. In essence, this is the idea of intertextuality. Because there is no all-controlling author's consciousness, it remains to perceive the text as a sum of quotations and allusions. This idea was proposed by Barthes and by his pupil Julia Kristeva, also a prominent theoretician of the 60s. Barthes himself said the following: Now, the text is a space of many dimensions composed of quotations referring to many sources. There are no elements of the text that could be generated personally, directly by the author. And the similar idea was developed by another French theorist, Michel Foucault. The concept of author is an appropriation of power, which is possessed by the discourse. The author should not longer be perceived as the single creator of the text, but just as some function, along with other functions of the text. Instead of the concept of author-creator appears the notion of authorial function, which exists not in all types of the texts. But even where it is, it constantly changing. The volatile author from whom we saw with Sasha Sokolov in the previous module is the clear illustration of such an idea.